No, I can. That is, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd like to extend a warm welcome. My name is Chanel van der Linde. I'm a senior researcher here at the Helen Suzman Foundation. And please forgive me if I'm reading a little bit from these notes. I don't want to get our panel's backgrounds incorrect. So I'd like to just say again, a warm welcome and thank you so much for joining us tonight. A special welcome as well to our executive director, friends of the foundation, as well as representatives from the Embassy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands and the delegation of Flanders. This evening is made possible with the backing of the Frederick Naumann Foundation, and I'd like to thank the foundation for their continued support of the work of Helen Suzman Foundation. FNF promotes freedom, liberalism, democracy, human rights, pluralism, tolerance, curbing climate change, an open and digital society, social market economy, and the rule of law. The Helen Suzman Foundation's mission clearly finds a partner in FNF in striving to honor the life and the work of Mrs. Suzman, with the focus on promoting constitutional democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. HSF's mission, and HSF tries to achieve this by, amongst other things, encouraging public dialogue on important topics to contribute to an informed, reasoned decision-making, as well as informed public participation. Gathering here tonight for this roundtable is one such initiative, where we are trying to tap into the discussions on the run-up to the G20, which is happening in less than a month from now, The Energy Transition Working Group under South Africa's G20 Presidency sets out to address critical issues of energy access and affordability, sustainable finance, and creating jobs of the future in the energy sector innovation. We believe it is now a good time to take stock of whether South Africa has used its presidency to push for the adoption of Global South priorities on a just energy transition. There are, of course, other working groups on finance and climate change that intersect and or support the JET efforts. Our panelists tonight are very much involved with the run-up to the G20, and we are really grateful that they could join us tonight during this really busy run-up and very busy time of the year to share their inputs and to engage with us. I'd like to take this opportunity to briefly introduce our guest and our facilitator for the evening. So Mr. Azwi Langa is the Executive Director and Founder of Africa Geostrategic Advisors. Over the course of his career, Azwi has specialized in global governance, climate democracy and diplomacy, geoeconomics, and international trade law. Until recently, he was a senior research fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Studies, where his research focused on critical minerals diplomacy and South Africa's G20 presidency. Azwi has previously worked with HSF, so we are happy to welcome him back tonight as the facilitator of our discussions. So in welcoming our panelists, it gives me great pleasure in introducing Ms. Joanne Yawich, who's the head of the Just Energy Transition Project Management Unit in the presidency. Joanne has had an illustrious career focusing on environmental affairs. She has held various senior positions in government in a career stretching back to 1994, which is a great year for South Africa. She is a commissioner in the National Planning Commission and was previously the Chief Executive Officer of the National Business Initiative, and prior to that, was the Deputy Director General for Climate Change in the Department of Environmental Affairs. May I also welcome and introduce Dr. Claude Kabemba, who is the Executive Director of Southern Africa Research Watch. Claude has 27 years of experience in research, policy, and advocacy. He is a recognized expert in the governance of natural resources, and he has edited books and published book chapters and articles on the topics of democratization, the African state, electoral politics, social policies, and natural resource governance, drawing on his extensive experience working in Southern and Central Africa. Our final panelist is Ms. Leanne Govinsamy, who is the head of Just Transitions at Southern Transitions, a non-profit climate and transition think tank working to advance just transition in the Global South. Leanne has a legal background with a strong focus on human rights and environmental law. She was previously the head of the Corporate Accountability and Transparency Program at the Center for Environmental Rights, and prior to that worked as head of legal and investigations at Corruption Watch. Our panelists will each get the opportunity to state their views, after which the audience with the facilitation of Azwi will get a chance to engage directly with our experts. Just a little bit of housekeeping is that if you do need the bathrooms, it is right around the corner, and then you will go out the main doors and to your left. And they should be on the right-hand side. Please feel free to grab yourself a water, and we will have refreshments served after the discussion. We thank you, and we hope that you enjoy the evening with us.
Thanks a lot, Chanel. Thanks a lot for HSF for organizing this discussion on the G20, on South African G20, and whether or not South Africa has managed to fulfill some of its promises or obligations around pushing Global South issues with regards to the just energy transition and issues related thereto. So this the G20 is very important in the sense that it's the first in Africa, and also it's the first held by South Africa, and also it's also the fourth that is being held consecutively by a Global South country, 3 or 2 of which are BRICS countries, which means there is an element of continuity. But because we want this, one of the main objectives of this discussion also is to simplify what the G20 is. As a resident of Joburg, when I was here in 2010, when we had the World Cup, one of the things that came out of that was the infrastructure development and crime going down. And there's a lot of people on the outside today, when they heard about the G20, they were saying at least we'll have roads improved, potholes closed, and other improvements in the city of Johannesburg. So that is the interface at least they have with the G20. And in this regard, I would want to start with our first panelist, Leanne, to kind of give us a background of what exactly the G20 is, and then in terms of the thematic areas, and also to the extent to which South Africa has managed to advance some of these issues around the just energy transition. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Azwi, and good evening, colleagues. A huge thank you to Nasima, Ezekiel, and the HSF team for organizing this important discussion and for the invitation. It's a real privilege to be speaking on this panel, and I look forward to the conversation here and in the room, and hopefully with people online as well. So I think we have about 10 minutes to make these introductory remarks. I hope that we'll be kept to time. I have a lot to say on this topic. I'd like to begin by recognizing the importance of this particular topic in the context of advancing a rights-based approach to the just energy transition and the wider just transition. There is a need to engage with the role of international cooperation in addressing inequalities, both within and between countries. And in selecting the topic for this year, being the 10th anniversary of the conclusion of the Paris Agreement, and at a time when geopolitical disorder has reigned in international politics and in trade, the HSF is recognizing the need to engage deeply with complex domestic and international realities, all of which has an impact on the realization of our own democratic project, right? These domestic objectives cannot be separated from fractured international relations and an increasingly polarized world order. So for my presentation today, I will highlight the context of our discussion with reference to the role of the G20, emphasize the need for a whole of economy, whole of society approach to energy transition planning, and the need for sector-specific and concrete implementation partnerships, which can advance different forms of justice, both locally and globally. And I will conclude with very brief reflections on the way forward as we come to the end of an era for Global South presidencies, G20 Global South presidencies, looking ahead to the US presidency next year and a 2027 UK presidency. So an oft-cited fact, which I think hasn't always settled with us as much as it should, is that about 600 million people in sub-Saharan Africa are living without access to electricity, pointing to the fact that our own lack of development has meant that our region has contributed the least to climate impacts, but stand to bear the most, or bear the brunt of the most severe impacts as our region becomes much warmer and drier compared to regions around the world. The Global South is therefore faced with immense risk as well as opportunity, and must respond to and address these multiple opportunities, multiple imperatives at the same time and with much urgency. In terms of the role of the G20 in advancing justice, both within and between countries, bearing in mind South Africa's constitutional obligations, why does the G20 matter? Well, in order to ensure that we have the necessary financing, technology, and reforms necessary to advance a truly just transition, we need international cooperation. We need financing, and we need sharing of technologies. So there are various working groups comprised of G20 member countries and invited guest countries that are involved in compiling ministerial declarations, which will build up to a leaders' summit, and hopefully a leaders' declaration. We're not sure that there will be a leaders' declaration, given that member countries have quite a bit of disagreement on a number of different issues, but including climate. And the US has, in fact, joined. They have sent representatives. There was a US representative at the ECSWG, which is the Environment, Climate, and Sustainability Working Group. And as you can imagine, there were a lot of disagreements about issues or references in the text, at least in the ministerial declaration, around the text, around equity between nations, around climate, even references to sustainable development goals. So you will see that play out in the Leaders Summit as well. And then there are dialogue forums. Dialogue forums comprise the Business 20, the Think 20, the Youth 20. There are a number of these dialogue forums that involve representatives, relevant representatives from different G20 member countries. Southern Transitions is a global South think tank. We sit on the Think 20, and we are also an official knowledge partner to the South African presidency. And we have a key role in the Environment, Climate, and Sustainability Working Group. Last week, we attended the third meeting of the ECSWG. There wasn't a ministerial declaration, but in fact, two separate declarations, one on environmental crimes and one that related to air quality, and then you had a kind of leader's summary. So you had not a leader's summary, a ministerial summary. And that was because we couldn't get, I would say, agreement in the room about some key issues. So, you know, we're all quite aware of the energy transition, that it sits within a complex and dynamic set of priorities, all of which are urgent and important. Our technical paper, so as Southern Transitions, we contributed to a technical paper, now an official presidency paper, within the ECSWG, and we have proposed a whole of economy, whole of society approach to energy transition planning. And we presented case studies which evidence such approach, and this approach is increasingly being used by the South African presidency, other member countries, and we've helped clarify and frame what a whole of society, whole of economy approach means. In taking forward this approach, we recognize that issues around the energy transition cut across multiple working groups and dialogue forums. It goes beyond the energy transition working group, and it's very important for us to create more linkages. We need to have a more holistic approach to the energy transition. And while South Africa is advancing Global South priorities, so in answer to your initial question, Answi, the presidency has had some successes on the issue of, let's say, clean cooking in the energy transition working group, but it's been very difficult to advance JET discussions and priorities. Member countries, including the US, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Argentina, resist language and commitments related to climate, justice, sustainable development goals, and are of course concerned about any language which is prescriptive around the selection of energy technology. So if you have any prescriptive language about phasing out fossil fuels, for example, that language is resisted. And in this context, we also need to move from rhetoric to real implementation. And we need to do so, or at least we as Southern Transitions have identified the need to develop sector-specific partnerships that can help us move in this direction. So we need to advance. So in the context of there being vast disagreement about language and commitments between member countries, disagreement even about common and differentiated responsibilities between states, we need to have implementation partnerships which bring together local or domestic actors in order to be a lot more clear and specific about what the Global South ask is. While the South African presidency can identify priorities, we need to be clear about what our ask is, and we need to have details around this. So one of the case studies which is presented in our technical paper and which was also the subject of a G20 side event and a proposed G20 legacy initiative is around a just steel transition implementation partnership. And this aims to meet multiple objectives and advance a sector-specific implementation partnership. We brought together labor, civil society, industry, government, as well as colleagues of Joanne's at the JET PMU to help us think about what it would take for us to not just decarbonize heavy industry like the steel industry in South Africa, but to meet the objectives of a just steel transition, addressing environmental harms that have been caused by this dirty industry, thinking about worker protection, including informal worker protection, restarting the Saldanha plant, which is a plant that could run on green hydrogen in order to kind of create green primary iron or make green primary iron, beneficiating iron ore in the region. And importantly, this rests on international cooperation. We need off-takers in Europe or in other parts of the world in order for this particular initiative to be bankable and in order for it to actually be realized. So, if I can just talk a little bit about the Just Steel Implementation Partnership and why it's very important in the context of international cooperation. Like I've mentioned, we need off-taking for green primary iron, and it helps us to beneficiate critical minerals. In our critical minerals strategy for South Africa, which has been released recently, this is a crucial aspect. We require technology transfers, so electrolyzers that operate at scale in order to make green hydrogen, in order to beneficiate the iron ore. We need the right type of finance with allocations to social protections, and we need to recognize that South Africa could be producing the most cost-competitive green primary iron globally, therefore making steelmakers in other regions more competitive. I'd like to conclude by saying that, in all likelihood, climate and energy transitions will not feature in the US G20 presidency. The ECSWG is not likely to be a working group, possibly the ETWG, and neither will issues around equity through the acknowledgement of CBDR between global North and South countries be featuring in the US presidency. So we need to think about how implementation partnerships in any of the working groups could bridge the gap between next year's presidency and connect into the UK presidency in 2027. We need to think quite innovatively about the mutual benefits around implementation partnerships for local or domestic partners, as well as in the context of strengthening international cooperation. I hope that has set the tone for this discussion, Ansvi. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Leanne. It has indeed set the tone. I think maybe one of my main takeaways from your intervention is this figure of 600 million people in Africa in sub-Saharan Africa who do not have access to electricity. And I was reading somewhere that 8 over 10 of Africans use coal and firewood and all other kind of stuff to as in their households. Someone could therefore argue that what we are really talking about is we should be focusing on, maybe instead of the transition, really is the issue of access. The other issue that I took away from your intervention is the issue of language, which sometimes we think is not important, but I understand the US is also a big issue on language. But there is someone, I met someone in Berlin, a very retired person who was an activist before in this space, but she said when they started focusing on these issues, it was around environment, the issue of the environment. And she says she thinks we lost the discussion, or somewhat what complicates this discussion now is the focus on climate, whereas people normally they resonate more with the issue of the environment. So if you talk more about the environment, people relate more than when you talk about the issue of climate. But since you ended up also on the issue of implementation, I think I will skip Dr. Kabemba for now and go to Joanne, who is from the PMU in the presidency. So the G20 task force released a document where they made 3 recommendations. One of the recommendations was the mobilization of finance. The other recommendation is to do with the acceleration of industrialization and, of course, the modernization of energy infrastructure. Because normally, what we normally struggle with in some of these issues is issues of implementation. And I would want to assume that since you are from PMU, you will be dealing also with issues that are related to finance and how some of the outcomes can be implemented. And in the issue of the G20 and how the global South priorities are being advanced, from where you are seated, to what extent have you seen some of the, maybe the low-hanging fruits that you feel like could be easily implemented going forward?
Okay. I'm not going to answer, I'm not going to start there because I do think that we need to have a realistic appreciation of what the G20 is and what it can and what it can't do. And I think we need to understand what is the G20 in an international context, and then what have we managed to do with a South African G20, and what have we managed to do through a South African G20 for the continent as a whole. And I think that some of the issues that you are asking are around that. So I do think that it operates at a set of different levels. I've participated in, not in a consistent way, but on and off, in the energy transition working group, the environment, and also in the sustainable finance working group. And I mean, remember the G20 started as a forum of finance ministers. And I do think that the G20 has an implicit pecking order, actually. No one will acknowledge it, but I do believe that the finance working groups have a degree of priority in the way that they then feed into the summit and the way they inform the outcomes of the summit, to be honest. And I think that what for me has been particularly important has been some of the work that the Sustainable Finance Working Group has done, co-chaired by, well, from the South African side, co-hosted by National Treasury and the Reserve Bank, then initially it was China and the US running it. And I think that they have done some very important work on trying to build, I suppose, a common and consensual platform on taking forward conversations around mobilization of sustainable finance, understanding what sustainable finance is. I think the work in the overall finance working group on debt and the international financial development financial architecture, as well as the climate finance architecture, is particularly important. And I think that if anything is going to feed upwards into a leader summit, some of that I think would be important and have a long-term impact going forward. I think that, regretfully, Leanne, I think you're probably right that both the climate and the energy transitions work has got a short lifespan at the moment. I mean, remember, the G20 goes in alphabetical order. So unless I'm missing out another A, you're going to have the US, you're going to have the UK, and then you have Argentina. And then it's a very long time until you come back to kind of the suite of the BRICS countries, I suppose, essentially chairing the G20. I think the second thing is that it is a negotiating forum, and it has all of the issues embedded in the G20 are the issues that we face in any of the big multilateral negotiating forums that the UN runs. And essentially, it's a consensus forum. You have to find a common, I don't want to say a lowest common denominator, because often it isn't, but there is an art to this that is about being able, in the interests of getting consensus and conclusion, the ability to be able to make necessary compromises. All of that not great for, I think, pursuing the kind of agenda that Leanne was talking to, and particularly in the energy context, because I do think that while energy and climate have been linked and the need to decarbonize is recognized, what that means in terms of time frames, in terms of pace, in terms of technology choice, in terms of who should be financing whom and how fast one should move, there is not agreement on those issues, and you end up starting to repeat the kinds of conversations that you would have in the negotiations in the UNFCCC, in the UNCCD, in any of these multilateral forums. So I think it's a difficult issue. I think South Africa has done an incredible job of managing the process of these working groups under incredibly difficult circumstances. I spend a lot of time with a whole lot of the international partners, and I think there is broad recognition that South Africa's diplomacy and as the host country, its ability to work across the board under these incredibly difficult circumstances has been quite extraordinary. And if I have any hope of a leaders' summit, it really is in the skill with which we have been able to manage a conversation in a world where multilateralism is fracturing. And where words like equality or diversity are kind of like a red rag to a bull. I think that the second thing is, I think that South Africa has been really good in raising the issues that confront the African continent in the context of the G20 and in starting to build the kind of partnerships, big partnerships that can in fact address issues of energy access. So I think this RE300 partnership, which is trying to mobilize finance globally around energy access to unserviced communities, is something that offers a lot of opportunity, even in our own country, to be able to move on issues of energy access and equality. I think that is one important example. I think our president has consistently, in every international forum he's been on in this regard, spoken to the issues of both climate change, energy transition, and a just energy transition. And I think that that is also important because I think being able to articulate a country vision in an international platform is also something that has been very important. More at a domestic level, I think that where we've done really well as a country has been in the fact that the G20 has been a very participatory process. Space has been opened up for a range of organizations in a way that Brazil to an extent has done it, but you haven't seen that level of participation by civil society, by labor, by a wide range of think tanks and NGOs have been able to both have access, be able to participate, be able to engage, and be able to essentially advocate for the things that they believe should be happening and that the G20 should be doing. And I think that that is a really important asset that South Africa and the South African presidency has really brought to the G20. So, as you can hear, I mean, I come to this with kind of, I suppose, too many years of experience of international negotiations to be hugely optimistic about kind of, the apex of this thing would be a consensus leaders declaration. If we can pull it off, we will have pulled off the miraculous. To be honest, we will have pulled off the miraculous. I think we might get quite close. I'm really optimistic that we can try and get quite close, maybe. But I do think that the ability to take the G20 and the G20 outcomes and turn it into practical activities on the ground across the continent is really what is much more important. We run this not only the JET PMU, which is trying to work towards the implementation of the country's just energy transition investment, plan, but we also work in the context of, I suppose, an embryonic country platform and a partnership with a set of international partners. There are quite a few countries across the continent that are starting to work in that way. Senegal is quite far advanced. The Kenyans, the Zambians, Malawi now, Lesotho, Ghana, Egypt are all involved in starting to build their own transition plans and in taking forward their own country view on this. And I think that for me, what would be really important is that we take whatever the outcome of the G20 is and the work that has gone into those G20 working groups, because there's some incredibly solid thinking around quite a wide range of issues, and be able to take that into those processes to try and really change the situation on the ground and really advance the energy transition. I mean, from where we sit, we would want to see a low carbon, climate resilient, net zero economy by 2050. Get going now. We'll use the G20 in our way forward to try and support that. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Joanne. It's good to get that optimism from you. From where I'm seated, I thought that consensus building and that multilateralism that you find within the G20 would have been highly compromised because of the posture that the US has taken on multilateralism. We had a question earlier in around June on whether or not it was a session where we're asking ourselves if there is a G20 without the US. But my understanding is that the US is very much participating, and so let's hope that in November that consensus will emerge. And also the G20, there was a point where they used to say that the G20 is in essence the G7 or G8 at some point takes decisions and then they get rubber stamped at the G20. But it's good to hear that South Africa as a global South country and as a middle power is able to lead in that regard. One of the issues or the unique things about the G20 this time is that the African Union is represented. So I want to understand from Dr. Kabemba two things. The first one is the extent to which Africa's position has been advanced within the G20 and in a way that will lead to a much better climate change outcomes. But maybe also talking to something that you are much more involved in, which is the issue of industrialization of value chains, regional value chains. Because one of the issues is that, as Leanne indicated earlier, that this is a cross-cutting issue. And for us to really have some of the real economic outcomes, the issue of critical minerals and how they can be harnessed for industrialization of global South countries or developing countries is very important. So I want to understand from yourself how this issue, as it relates to climate change issues, has been advanced, both by the AU, if any, is being done by the AU, depending on what the AU's priorities are, and also by global South countries, which themselves are fragmented when it comes to this issue. Thanks.
Chair, thank you very much. Let me preface my intervention by saying I adopt what Joanne and Leanne have said. So if I don't say anything that they said, it means I've said it. I think that we don't have a lot of time. Look, the Southern Africa Resource Watch, which I represent, we work across really the continent now. We were mostly Southern and Central Africa. Now we go across really the continent, and we really go to talk to communities. And I would like to position my intervention around the African people. So, look, today when you go to Serenje, that is in Zambia, where an Indian company is extracting manganese, there are 470 people workers who are sick, seriously sick. And they can't talk. They've been affected seriously because of the process of manganese. And there have been difficulties to compensate them. And we've been engaged to scale up that case so that they're compensated and the companies is held to account. Just recently you heard about the tailing dam that broke and destroyed the entire Kafue River, on which almost 6 million people depend for their livelihood in terms of land, fisheries, and so on. Just this week, a worker in Zimbabwe was killed. In Kafue River, it was a copper extraction by a Chinese company. In Motoko, a Zimbabwean worker was killed because he was asking for a living wage in the lithium mining company. In the DRC, people have been displaced in the cobalt mining company and rivers across that region. As you'll know, Lualaba province in the DRC is the capital of cobalt, but the rivers almost have been polluted, and nobody's there to go and evaluate and try to clean. In bauxite, in Guinea, people have been displaced without free and prior informed consent. So I raise this issue because when you look at some of the biggest challenge we are having on the continent is the triple challenge of unemployment, poverty, and inequality. And if we are going to resolve these things, one of the things you are looking at, because of our producer power in critical minerals. As you know, the Congo produces 70% of cobalt that we put on the international market. The Congo and Zambia put together, Congo produces 3 million tons of copper each year. Zambia now has gone to 1 million. It's 3 million or 4 million tons of copper. And you know, going forward, we will need for the energy transition to be sustainable between now and 2040, closer to 22 million tons of copper. And since the world has been world, we've only used 22 million tons of copper. So in 2 decades, we need to produce as fast as possible 22 million tons of copper. So that rapid production is leaving behind very serious ecological problem. But as they extract, as you'll hear, we are in the process of trying to attract investment, because we need to deal with some of these social challenges. But the core, which is not new, the issue of industrialization, the entire independence on the African continent was not just political, was also economic. It was about control, ownership, and the use of our resources, adding value to industrialize. And we've all agreed, and I think in the discussion at the G20, and South Africa has done quite well to promote the issue of industrialization and value addition, that by not doing that, we are exporting jobs, we are exporting our economies, and we are exporting industrialization. So there is a strong call for that. So for us, I think the just energy transition is not just about decarbonization. It's about structural economic transformation. And that way, I think, I would like to say, when you look at the South African approach to the G20, I think what Joanne has said is very correct. South Africa has done quite well to represent the voice of the South and the voice of Africa. But is what South Africa pushing really the voice of the African people? The way South Africa has gone about to register those issues, how did they come about? the AU is a member of the G20, but I don't think the AU and South Africa have harmonized their views. And I don't think there is anybody who knows the position of the AU. I think, as you know, it's quite a dysfunctional institution, which acquires the functionality of its member state. So we don't expect much. But my sense is that the EU should have been the institution representing the African voices and not South Africa. In fact, if what should have been happening, what we've been looking at is that it would have been better for South Africa to open up just at the beginning for each country on the African continent to start reflecting on its narrative around the just energy transition. And remember, it's not a linear process. Even within one country, the just energy transition will be defined quite differently. The people who are in the forest, they'll talk about just energy transition differently from people in the savannah. People who've got access to energy, and those who don't have will define it quite differently. So my sense is that we should have had a situation where we collect information from below and bring it at the center. And I would have thought that bringing all countries into this space could have gone from countries to regional economic commissions up to the AU. And come with that to be a really blueprint of what Africa wants in the G20. Now, the G20 is an amalgamation of countries. And when you look at some of the countries that are important and strategic that can support Africa, they are all in Africa, individually, signing bilateral agreements to access these critical minerals, not because they want to industrialize on this continent, because they want them for their own industry. Now, and really the competition between China and the US will intensify. And I don't think anybody, remember, whoever controls these resources will control the world. These resources are not just for decarbonization, they're also for defense, and mostly for defense. When you look at the strategic position of the US, as you know, Trump has opted out from energy transition, but it's mostly for defense. So what we are looking at here, really, I would have expected that. And my assumption that if we had that approach, I think these are the issues that would have put on the table in the G20. One would have been that as Africa, we are bringing this framework for the G20 to sign. Because the things that we are discussing have been discussed for many years. They're not new. But what has lacked is how do we go about to force the world to support Africa? But Africa today is so in a position of power because of the monopoly it has on these resources. So one, I know, I know one of your research, really, which is very good, speaks about how we should not very much talk about Africa as having all these mineral resources. They can be found somewhere else and so on. But I always argue that the criticality of these resources in Africa should not be looked at individually by country by country. The criticality must be looked at the continental level because we are pushing for unity of the continent. So when you look at that and you follow that argument, so you'll see that we are the producer power in cobalt, we'll be the producer power in manganese, we'll produce in lithium. Remember lithium, the DRC has just discovered which could be the most biggest reserve of lithium. So you'll go on and on. I think we could be the biggest producer of all these critical minerals. So we have this power, why aren't we using it? So the first thing which I was saying is that no minerals will leave the continent without value addition. But you will understand that we can't also add value because we are incapable, we don't have energy for manufacturing. And we will demand that they support us to create to produce sufficient energy for manufacturing. But I'm a proponent of renewable energy, but we can't wait for development to have maximum renewable energy that can power our industrialization. We've got hydro on this continent, the Inga Dam. It's very difficult when you put the Inga Dam in the G20. They'll all not want to touch it. But as you know, the Inga Dam can power the entire continent and part of Europe. But Ethiopia, the Renaissance Dam, has just demonstrated that Africans on themselves, they can build these things. Ethiopia just built a multi-million dam from their own resources. They did not need the World Bank, they did not need the IMF. So there are issues of finance. As you know, through the climate change, the Paris Agreement, so Africa should be given at least 300 billion. It will never come. And we need to come to that realization. And we start to do, how can we do domestic resource mobilization? That one. Secondly, ESG. Any company that pollutes, that violates human rights, that destroy the ecosystem must pay, must repair, and if they fail, they should not continue extracting on the continent. And the last one, I think, is that workers. Most of the working force must be an African force. You'll see that there's a lot of exodus, many people coming on the continent to do just small works that African can do. But that will require capable state, a functional state, and it will require mostly leadership. And my sense is that we are lacking in most of those dimensions. I'll leave it there.
For those insights. I mean, you raise a lot of issues. It's good to hear that. Maybe one would have thought that the AU, being part of the G20, would have sort of amplified its agency with an A, and I think South Africa also having been part of the G20 and other fora, one would also assume that they have an element of institutional memory. And also, South African foreign policy tends to kind of say, push also an African position. What I think some of the issues that you raised, maybe they take us back to where we started, the issue of how this discussion has been framed, the issue of global South issues. I mean, there's questions sometimes on what really constitutes the global South. And maybe from trying to understand, maybe from all of you as panelists, the issue of sometimes the global South, where we tend to think it's like it's a homogeneous group, but it seems from some of the issues that Kabemba is raising, there's the issue of China. If you look at the critical minerals issue, some of these, most of the countries that you mentioned and some of the issues happening there, they have most to do with the Chinese companies that are invested there. So it'll be interesting to understand how some of these dynamics are playing out within the G20, which are of a sort of a geopolitical nature, and how they are being managed, and how they are sort of impacting on the outcomes, or how they might impact on the outcomes that relate to climate change issues.
Okay, so when I saw the title of this thing, the first question that comes to my mind is, what are the Global South priorities? And can you say that there are Global South priorities? For me, I really think this is subjective. It depends on where are you coming from, what are your core concerns, and therefore, how do you understand this? But I do think that in an African context, we are, I mean, we may well be at the beginning of the second scramble for Africa. around the issue of critical minerals. And I do think that Africa's colonial past and the economies that were the extractive economies that were built and the economies that were destroyed, most importantly to build the extractive economies, have had a very, very long lasting impact on the continent's development path. And I do think that it is in the interest of all African countries that both our energy, that there's energy sovereignty, and I think that that does extend to the issue of critical minerals. But I think that the geopolitics of the day, which are acquisitive, are increasingly militaristic, and increasingly designed to support the self-interest of different countries, make it very, very difficult to be able to talk about within a country, let alone across countries, about what is the common agenda. So you know, to be honest, this all comes down to your own politics and where you come from. What's your perspective? What's your filter that you're looking at this issue from? What's your organization's filter, and what is your country's filter? I think South Africa has been very, very good as a country on multilateralism, on global solidarity, on trying to address at a global level the issues of inequality and poverty. It's a pity we haven't done better in our own country. But I think we are a very good proponent globally of the need for equity and the need for a very wide set of reforms, including in the global economic system, in order that those inequities are addressed. But this is a complicated issue. And I think at the level of something like the G20, what you're doing is you get a headline view of it. And then there is a lot of devil in the detail here. So you know, for us in South Africa, the just transition is really about how do we leave no one behind? How do we ensure that people who currently have jobs do not lose them? How do we create value chains and new enterprises that are going to absorb more people, that are going to give them a decent chance at life? I mean, those are the issues that the just transition means for us. When we talk to our colleagues in Vietnam or Indonesia, it has a very, very different meaning. You know, for them it is about how, in some cases it's just about how do you set up businesses. In some cases it is just about how do you, in Senegal it's about access. So I think understanding those dimensions and then being able to find a common framing, for me, is what the art of something like the G20 is, and never ever giving up on multilateralism. I think we must never ever forget that the kind of multilateral order that we have built up, the post-war order, which is fracturing at the moment, was built up to find a way that countries could coexist with each other and fight with each other without going to war. You know, I think we have more conflict across the world now than we have had for decades. And I think at our peril do we actually give that up. And that's why something like the G20 as a talk forum that allows differences to be aired without having to fight about them, or to prevent, to reach agreements that prevent war and fighting, becomes so critical. Yeah.
No, I think that's an important question. And I think Johan has addressed some very important issues. I think, let me just give you some statistics, just you'll understand a little bit what I want, maybe if it opens. When you take in Zambia, the refined copper is sold at $5 $3.8 per kilogram. And it can reach to $150 a kilogram for a finished good. So Zambia loses almost 28% of what it can gain from its resources. A study that was done in 2023, the production of some 4 years of Zambia copper could have been giving Zambia, if Zambia was adding value of copper in the country at $524 billion. But Zambia, for those years, was only able to collect 3.5 billion. Now, I raise this simply to say the continent is not poor. We have got plenty of money. And the issue of finance and debt should not be happening to this continent. But the geopolitics and the way this continent has been integrated in the global system is that these resources, either they are being accessed at the cheapest price or for free in some countries. But the question for me is, how do we turn around on that? So it's power relations. Individually, we are so weak, including South Africa, our biggest economy and industrialized country on the continent, is still very weak on the global stage. So my sense is that we need unity, really, to be able to stand and ensure that we control on our resources. That's one. Secondly, the issue of technology. This issue of transfer of technology, nobody will give technology to you, for you to compete, and it does not happen. People steal technology. China has been accused of stealing technology. Why can't we even steal as Africans? But we steal in the coffers for just to steal technology. We have failed. That espionage. Even today and tomorrow, European, American, they're all stealing from each other. Us, we are even able. You think when you say we are going to steal is morally, no, it's not. That's what is happening. In fact, most of our innovation from our universities has been taken over by other countries. That technology. So debt, how do you borrow and refuse to pay? Look, this issue of debt, we have had cancellation for many times. Every time cancellation. Every time cancellation. And when they cancel, we borrow again more and more and more and more. I think there is an issue of level of audacity. How do we become the audacity to do things differently? And the audacity to stand on some of the most principal things that can help us to move forward. Look, my sense, I totally agree. The dialogue is important. I think I'm a believer that it's through dialogue that come solutions. But we dialogue more with outsiders than we dialogue as a continent. And for me, it will be difficult. As we know, the South African leadership on the continent is challenged. There are people who don't believe that South Africa should speak for them because South Africa is pushing its own interest. So when you stand in the G20, you see I'm speaking on the African banner. There are leaders outside who have been part of it, they are contesting. When you go to Europe through the gateway, you get 250 billion, I think South Africa got for. People sit to say, oh. But those are the issues you discuss at the continent. And we will not do much if you are not united. I think the only option we have is unity. The market is too small. Then we need to integrate. I think those are some of the things we need to do.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I think briefly, Leanne, before we open it up for questions and answers.
Thanks, Ansby. And I just want to completely agree with the question or the issue of like having unity, right? And it must be coupled with proper implementation partnerships, like I've mentioned, right? And oftentimes, the conditions of the finance for Global South countries, and let's even take South Africa's JP, for example, is raised. And we kind of need to have a new way of looking at this and saying, what are the conditions that we are imposing, right? Are we engaging with financiers to say, we want allocations of finance for social protections that can both bring down greenhouse gas emissions and address environmental harms, and to the question that you were raising. And we need to have the domestic resource mobilization, but think very critically about what our ask is. And so just to briefly add that building these domestic or local implementation partnerships and being very clear about what we want is critical, because the EU ultimately doesn't want to lose jobs. This is the issue we're faced with. They don't want to lose jobs by offshoring the value chain to South Africa or to the continent. That is what it boils down to, right? But we can also have a different narrative that says, if the EU or any other member countries access some of the cheapest beneficiated iron ore or other minerals from South Africa or other regions, it enables them to be more competitive in the global market. So we have to move beyond this mindset that says we're losing something and speak more about what it is that will be gained by ensuring that our minerals are beneficiated locally, given that we have the cheapest electricity prices. We know that Europe's electricity prices are rising, and it poses a threat, even in the steel industry, as Europe rearms, for example, right? And having the right partners in the global south that are reliable for security of supply is something we need to kind of be bringing to the fore here, because it's not spoken about enough. But just to also flag this middle power framing that you highlighted, Ansby, is critical in this space, because there are rising middle powers that are increasingly working together and may well displace what have been the traditional powers within the G20 or the G7 even. But yeah, back to you.
We'll now open up the floor for any questions. I'm not sure if there are the people on the online platform also.
Good evening. My name is Tempelani Mazibugo from the Electoral Institute for Sustainable Democracy in Africa. My question is for Leanne. Is there any point for you and your organization where the just energy transition just becomes untenable? Let's say, for example, just energy transition forecast there will be tens of thousands of jobs lost in Mpumalanga, or electricity prices will increase dramatically, or electricity supply will be unstable because, you depend on the weather on the day, especially given that South Africa and Africa, as you've stated, contributes so little towards global climate change. Is there any point at all where, for your organization, the just energy transition must be rethought or not go ahead, or is it just full steam ahead for you guys?
I don't know much about the G20 or energy. My bag is the rule of law. And if I've got a filter coming here, somebody mentioned a filter. My filter is the rule of law, so I know about that. And when I look at big, complex programs like the G20, I know that you've got to have the systems to back them up. That's the rule of law is the most fundamental, to me, system of governance. And it's widely accepted, and most people kind of approve and know of it. Without a proper governance system, you've got all these pieces of the puzzle. You've got a picture of where you want to go with the G20, climate change and equal justice for all. But you don't have the tool, the method, the process, without the governance in order to effect them. So you can't have a big project without governance. And from watching South African state capture, it was an attack on the rule of law, and it destroyed the capacity of our government to respond to opportunities like the G20. So that's the first point. The main act to do with energy in South Africa is the National Energy Act. Is that right?
There are a lot of them. Yes, but there's an energy regulation amendment.
So I want to just make a point, a practical point about what I'm saying. The Energy Act is Act 34 of 2008. It was commenced by Naledi Pandor, who was acting president at the time. She signed the commencement notice as president. First question. The Act was put into force except for Section 6, which only in the last year was put into force, from 2008 to a year or two ago, 2013, I think. When that happened, I ordered all commencements of all acts, because you can't have implementation without commencement. The Energy Act, Section 6, is specifically to do with you know it, Joanne, I'm sure, with an integrated development plan for energy. Without that, the Act becomes lifeless. Without the commencement of Section 6, I happened to notice that there'd been a long interim period between the passing of the Act, its ascension, and its the inapplication of Section 6. I only picked up in about 2013 that it hadn't been commenced. When I saw a case, I also ordered where the acts that are referred to in cases are commenced and they comply with publication, so forth. When I noticed with the UWD versus ESCOM case that they were referring to Section 6. And I rang a bell and I looked up Section 6, it hadn't been commenced. That was almost 10 years after it had been promulgated. It still hadn't been commenced. Now, the President's office is responsible for commencement. Without that Act, without that key Section 6, we don't have the platform in government to direct resources and energies towards a project like G20, let alone any of the other projects. Thanks. Beg your pardon?
Are there any other questions
Thanks.
in this round? Okay.
Thank you. I'm Emmanuel Siete. I am a human rights and public interest activist and an attorney. Mine is quite short, rather. I do understand the environmental benefit of the transition plan, but I have a social concern, which is three-pronged. My first concern is this. In the city currently, we have a billing crisis, whereby the city is taken to court back and forth about incorrect meter readings and incorrect billings, you name it. And this has led to numerous level 3 disconnection notices issued in various communities. I can count 13, from Lenasia to, is it Innerdale? There are some, I will name them as and when I'm speaking. Now, these communities are without access to electricity as we speak. They cook using fires and paraffin stoves. And firstly, I'm a dilettante when coming to global warming and environmental issues. But I want to think that global warming, part of it is caused by house fires, isn't it? By cooking with coal and so forth. So we have people that are living like that currently because of level 3 disconnection notices by the city, right? And this transition plan, as and when it comes about, my question is, will it make electricity at all cheaper for the people? Because it would not make sense, and for me it would be counterproductive for the plan not to reduce the financial burden on the people and consequently force them to get these level 3 disconnection notices again and go back to cook on the fires that cause global warming. So my question is, will it be cheaper for the people of South Africa or for the people of the continent? The second issue has to do, as I think my brother raised it here, an issue of access. Access without the level 3 disconnection notice. This is access in terms of the constitution at least. There are still areas in South Africa and in Africa, I believe, that are without electricity. Do we have a plan to work around that? Because it seems now that the problem is with local government to begin with. Is this plan going to come about with electricity or access to electricity for the people? Or does Helen Suzman Foundation, as an example, need to go and force the government in court to give basic services to the people? Is there a framework around that? And then...
maybe you stop there. We take the last question in this round, then we will come back to...
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. My name is Nolutando Mwangele. I'm coming from the Revelation Spiritual Institution. The Revelation Spiritual Institution is an umbrella for the Mzuvukile Slapat Khatebe Institute, which is an academic institute. My point here is that as the institution, we are not taken into consideration by the G20, and we are not included for the sustainable development outcomes and goals. So what I'm saying in this meeting, our priorities as South Africans or as an African continent are not considered by the G20. So what I'm saying, there is an element that is left behind, and that is why we're coming from as an institution. And I think that is the reason why scientific investigators always come up with wrong conclusions, because there's an element that is left out. And I think our institution can bridge this gap for the country and for the nation. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Some of the questions were not directed to particular individuals, but there's a question for you, Leanne, which talked to, is it just energy transition full steam, or I guess it talks, cross-cutting is the questions are talking about the just element of the transition and how this is taken into consideration within the G20 framework.
Yeah, I don't think that there'll be a point where the jet becomes untenable. I think what we recognize is that there are multiple unintended consequences that could arise, right? And we have to recognize that. And the real question is, how do we address these kind of parallel imperatives? The imperative to transition, it is a climate one. There are carbon border taxes that are going to impact South Africa and the goods that it produces. So there is like a real imperative for us to be able to transition, right? But the consequences may be that industry accesses cheaper energy than households, for example, right? And the consequences of that are quite significant. So the actual question is, how do we come up with new approaches and new ideas to reinvigorate our approach to the jet and to think about this in a more inclusive way, to think about inequality, energy poverty, to bring in local actors in order to advance a more just outcome. So I think there is not a world where I think the transition is going to halt, but it's how we go about the transition that really matters. Right now, renewable energy is the cheapest form of electricity globally. You know, whether if it's gas, you've still got to build the infrastructure for gas. You know, we need to acknowledge the risks associated with fossil fuel developments, and we need to weigh that up against what are the cheapest energy options. But again, it is up to a capable state for us to be able to realize those gains at a very local level and for households, because those energy prices, as they come down, they need to be able to have a positive impact for households. But yeah, we don't have a lot of time, so I'll hand over to Claude and Joanne.
Should I come in on? Let me come in on the question that you asked in the issue of the rule of law. And maybe just talk a little bit about the work that we are doing, which has got nothing directly to do with the G20. So the unit that I work in sits in the presidency. It sits alongside units like Operation Vulindlela, the National Electricity Crisis Committee, the Presidential Youth Employment Initiative. We're a small delivery unit. Our job fundamentally is to build the capacity within government and in partnership with business, with labor, with civil society to implement the just energy transition. And we recognize the fragility of the state and the lack of state capacity. And we recognize the fact, I certainly recognize the fact, I spent 17 years in government, that state capture had a devastating impact on the capacity of the state to deliver services to people. And that there is still a very large corruption problem. Nevertheless, you've got to sort that problem out. You can't give up, sit back and give up. So in the work that we are doing, we have what we call a municipal portfolio. And in that work, we are looking at the issues around two things: municipal distribution. So the fact that the grid in this town, a large part of which is provided by the city of Johannesburg, is constantly collapsing. And it needs to be upgraded, it needs to be modernized if we are going to bring in renewables as a source of being able to supply, particularly people in townships and informal settlements. You've got to fix the grid. So that's one of the focus areas. I don't have an immediate solution to the problem, but we recognize that as one of the issues that has got to be resolved. And we are working to look at how you can get the finance mobilized for the kind of infrastructure development that is necessary for that to happen, that would have a more stable system. The second side that we are looking at is the energy access issue. Whatever people say, coal, electricity is seriously expensive. It's why people steal electricity, and it's why people are cooking with wood and paraffin in their homes. It's because they can't afford to pay the municipality. We are looking at working across government to start building and working with National Treasury and looking at the subsidy framework that exists for local government in the electricity system, to look at how we can reform that so that you start to be able to provide, firstly, free basic electricity to those who actually need it, because most indigent people don't get it. Secondly, be able to utilize cheaper forms of renewable power for that. Look at distributed generation, look at off-grid solutions for communities. So that work is in its early stages. It's going to take a few years to get going. But I think in the long run, those are the kinds of solutions that are going to be necessary for the poor in this city and cities and villages across the country to be able to address the kinds of problems that you're raising.
Thanks, Joanne. And Dr. Kabemba,
Just a quick
briefly,
one on governance. I think governance is you can't do without. I think we just have to invest in. Look, I think it's an issue that is spoken about, but is not on the agenda. But my sense is that as things are discussed, issue of corruption, issue of illicit financial flows, issue of tax evasions, all those things are discussed. But remember, I think it's more at first and foremost at country level that we need to get things right. Because even if when you come together as a unit, as the continent, if we come in a much weaker state, we just reproduce a unity that is also very weak and unstable. So governance, I think people need to be educated to fix our governance system.
Yes,
which definitely said. But on energy, Chair, yes. I think the problem is that the energy is expensive, but people are also unemployed. So that's fine. So I think we need to solve that one.
The networking session where you can continue that discussion. But to your point, you said Nompumelelo, Nolutando. I think in the G20 there is a social. You know these groups.
Thanks, Ntando. There's a social summit that is coming up. So I think on the G20 website, there is a registration process to join the social summit and to submit working papers as well. I'm sure the research would be very welcome in that process. Ansby, should I quickly make concluding remarks?
Yes.
I just wanted to thank the panel and you for facilitating this discussion and say there's also an anti-corruption working group as part of the Sherpa track of the G20. So these issues are complex. The energy transition fits into multiple priorities. These are hard and difficult issues to try and get around. And I think it's going to take all of us. International cooperation can solve one layer of the problem, but it requires us to have very local, specific, action-oriented plans first and foremost. And yeah, I think that's what we're working on.
1 minute concluding remarks, Dr. Kabemba, then Joanne, then Dr. Lirette will come and give a vote of thanks and close. We're really running out of time. We can continue on. Is it a pending question? Okay.
Thank you, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Jose Moleshe from Bayaka Infrastructure Fund. My comment is that we talk a lot about justice, and we talk about a just energy transition, but it does not translate into genuine effort. In terms of just energy in terms of energy in general, or every aspect, whether it's environment, NDCs, whether it's the integrated resource plan, we've got plans for everything else but the just. So it's talked about, it's insinuated, but there is no plan. How are we going to address the issues that relate to the just energy transition? We talk about Mpumalanga. The mining industry does not only impact on Mpumalanga, it impacts on the macro economy, whether it's the financing houses based in Sandton, servicing that, whether it's the legal aspects. So we also are not diagnosing the problem properly, in my view. Free basic electricity. How long did the government come up with that policy? And what have we done when we realize that free basic electricity is not accessible to those who are supposed to access it? Do we have a plan around that? No, we don't. But we do have a plan around renewable energy. We even came up, I was part of that at the DBSA, we came up with a framework that's bankable because there are IRRs. Investors will get output. That's truly what South Africa is concerned about. Let's stop fooling each other. Thank you.
No, thank you. Just to say justice, you need to fight for it. I think people need to be educated to fight for justice. But it's not fighting in terms of burning. It's fighting to reclaim the right and to ensure that we've got the correct government in place that care about the people, that fight corruption. But it was great to be here, and I think for this continent, unity is the most important one, but unity driven by correct leadership.
Thanks. I think that by and large I've said enough. Thank you for inviting me. I think these issues are complex. I think people feel incredibly strongly about them, and the question is really what is the avenue? What are the avenues for people to be able to exercise and to practically start to address the kind of issue that you are raising? I mean, I think there are, but I do think that the levels at which we're having this conversation is complicated. We've gone right from the global to very, very specific and local. And, you know, it needs actually a lot more time than we have this evening to really delve into that. But thank you very much.
My role is really on behalf of the foundation to say thank you very much for coming out tonight. Like Joanne has just said, it will take a lot more conversation. I can see people are passionate here tonight. We're so grateful that you came out, honored our invitation. So my role is thanking you. As I would like to start with F&F again. Kwazi, thank you very much. The evening would not have been possible without you. The evening would not have been possible without your passion coming to engage us tonight. And of course to our speakers. I mean, you're extremely busy. And you made time for us, and we're really grateful for that. And I mean, if we take one message away from myself, is that we must continue talking, whether it's at the multilateral level or at this level where we can gather as South Africans and continue talking. Thank you very much, and there's some refreshments. We will open the door there. Please don't go hungry, because it's very late, and drive safe. And thank you very much for supporting us, and thank you to the staff of the foundation for making this evening possible. To our Executive Director, Nasima, and everybody else, please join us. Thank you.